Master Sullivan emerged from the dojo precisely at the agreed time, moving with the measured steps that characterized everything he did. He had changed from his training GI into simple civilian clothes, dark slacks and a white button-down shirt, but his posture and bearing still conveyed the disciplined presence that commanded respect from his students. "Mr. Martinez," Sullivan said, extending his hand in greeting. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I know you work long hours, and I appreciate you coming here tonight." Manuel shook the offered hand, his grip firm but cautious. At 45 years old, he had learned to be wary of smooth-talking men who wanted to discuss his son's activities. Too many teachers and counselors had made promises they couldn't keep, or had judged his family without understanding the realities they faced as Mexican immigrants in a predominantly white community. "Danny says you wanted to talk about this karate business," Manuel said directly, his English carrying the slight accent that marked him as someone who had learned the language as an adult. "I got to tell you straight up, Sensei, we're not a rich family. We can't afford to waste money on things that don't help Danny become a man." Sullivan nodded respectfully, recognizing the practical concerns behind the father's blunt words. In his years of teaching, he had encountered many working-class parents who viewed martial arts training with suspicion, seeing it as an expensive hobby rather than valuable education. "Would you be willing to observe a brief training session, Mr. Martinez?" Sullivan asked. "I think it would help you understand what your son has been learning, and why I believe it will serve him well as he grows into manhood." Without waiting for an answer, Sullivan gestured for both father and son to follow him into the dojo. The main training area was spartanly furnished, with kata charts on the walls showing the sequential movements of various forms, and photographs of Okinawan and Japanese masters who had shaped the art that Sullivan taught. "Danny, assume the ready position," Sullivan commanded, his voice taking on the formal tone he used during instruction. The teenager immediately moved to the center of the floor, his feet positioned in the ready stance that had become second nature after 3 months of training. Manuel watched with growing interest as Sullivan began to lead his son through a series of basic techniques. The movements were precise and controlled, each block and strike executed with attention to proper form and breathing. This was clearly not the wild, undisciplined fighting that Manuel had feared his son was learning. "Show your father the Heian Shodan kata, Danny," Sullivan instructed. "Perform it as you would during a belt examination, with full focus and proper spirit." Danny took a deep breath and began the familiar sequence of movements that represented months of patient practice. His hands moved through the opening sequence with the confidence that came from countless repetitions. His stances strong and his transitions smooth. Manuel had never seen his son demonstrate such disciplined concentration. As the kata progressed, Sullivan provided quiet commentary for Manuel's benefit. Each movement has a specific application against an attacker. The opening sequence teaches distance and timing. The crossing blocks develop the ability to deflect multiple strikes while maintaining balance. Nothing is decorative. Every technique serves a practical purpose in self-defense. Manuel found himself impressed despite his initial skepticism. The movements his son was demonstrating required obvious physical conditioning, but they also demanded mental focus and emotional control. This was not the flashy showmanship he had expected, but disciplined training that reminded him of the military drills he had observed during his brief time in the army. "Now, Mr. Martinez, I would like you to observe how your son handles pressure," Sullivan said, moving to face Danny in a sparring position. "Danny, defend yourself as I attack, but remember that control and technique are more important than force." Sullivan began a series of slow, controlled attacks that allowed Danny to demonstrate the blocks and counterattacks he had learned. The teenager's responses were measured and precise, never wild or overly aggressive. When Sullivan increased the pressure slightly, Danny maintained his composure, breathing steadily and moving with the fluid grace that marked good karate technique. "Stop," Sullivan commanded, and both fighters immediately returned to the ready position. "Mr. Martinez, what did you observe during this exercise?" Manuel considered the question carefully before answering. He didn't lose his temper. "When you came at him harder, he didn't panic or try to hurt you back. He just stayed calm and did what you taught him." Sullivan smiled, recognizing that the father had grasped the most important aspect of what they were teaching. "Exactly. The physical techniques are important, but the mental discipline is what will serve Danny throughout his life. When he faces challenges at school, at work, or in his relationships, He will have the tools to remain calm and make intelligent decisions rather than reacting from anger or fear. The master moved to one of the makeshift makiwara posts that he had constructed along the back wall of the dojo. The canvas-wrapped striking surface showed the wear marks of hundreds of conditioning sessions, and several photographs nearby showed the scarred knuckles of advanced practitioners who had spent years developing their technique. Traditional karate training also develops physical toughness, Sullivan explained, demonstrating a series of strikes against the makiwara. But this conditioning is gradual and progressive. We don't encourage students to injure themselves or prove their toughness through reckless behavior. The goal is to develop the body and mind together, creating strength that lasts a lifetime. Manuel approached the striking post and examined it closely, running his hands over the canvas surface and testing its construction. As someone who worked with heavy machinery every day, he could appreciate the craftsmanship that had gone into creating training equipment that would withstand years of use. "How much does this training cost?" Manuel asked directly, addressing the practical concern that had been weighing on his mind since Danny first expressed interest in martial arts. $25 per month, Sullivan replied honestly. "I know that represents a significant expense for your family, but I would be willing to offer Danny a partial scholarship in exchange for helping with maintenance and cleanup duties around the dojo. Hard work and dedication are more important to me than ability to pay full tuition." The offer surprised both father and son, providing a potential solution to the financial obstacle that had threatened to end Danny's training. 3 months had passed since that pivotal evening when Master Sullivan sat down with Manuel Martinez, and the November chill of 1968 had settled over Springfield like a familiar blanket. The community center's parking lot showed the first traces of frost, and inside the dojo, the warmth from the baseboard heaters mixed with the energy of students moving through their evening training session. Danny Martinez had changed in ways that went far beyond his improved technique and conditioning. His white belt was now permanently stained with the honest sweat of countless training sessions, and his hands bore the calluses that marked a serious student of traditional karate. But the most significant change was in his bearing, the quiet confidence that came from months of disciplined practice and the knowledge that he had earned his place in the dojo through dedication rather than privilege. Master Sullivan observed his students with the practiced eye of an instructor who had spent decades watching young people transform themselves through martial arts training. The evening class included a mix of teenagers and adults, each working at their own level, but all united by the common pursuit of self-improvement that defined traditional JKA karate. "Line up for closing ceremony," Sullivan commanded, his voice carrying the familiar authority that brought immediate order to the training floor. The students quickly formed ranks according to belt level, with Danny taking his position among the other white and yellow belts who made up the majority of the class. As they knelt in Caesar position for the formal closing, Sullivan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The arrangement he had worked out with Manuel Martinez had proven beneficial for everyone involved. Danny's father had agreed to allow the training to continue in exchange for his son's help with maintenance duties around the dojo, and Manuel himself had begun stopping by occasionally to observe classes and understand what his son was learning. "Sensei Nirei," Sullivan called out, and the students bowed in unison, their voices joining in the traditional os that marked the end of formal training. As the class dispersed, Danny remained behind, as he had every evening for the past 3 months, gathering the scattered equipment and preparing the floor for the next day's session. The work gave him time to think about how much his life had changed since that night when Sullivan had found him crying in the corner of the changing room. The bullies at school still existed, but they no longer seemed like insurmountable obstacles. More importantly, the conflicts with his father had evolved into something resembling mutual respect. "Martinez," Sullivan called from his small office adjacent to the training floor. "Come here for a moment." The autumn of 1968 cast long shadows across the Springfield Community Center as Master Thomas Sullivan locked up his small karate dojo for the evening. The fluorescent lights flickered off one by one, leaving only the glow from the street lamps filtering through the dusty windows. At 42 years old, Sullivan had spent the last 15 years building his reputation as one of the most respected karate instructors in the Midwest, having learned the art while stationed in Okinawa during his Navy service. As he gathered, his worn canvas gear bag, a soft sound caught his attention. It was barely audible, almost lost beneath the hum of the building's old heating system. Sullivan paused, his weathered hands still gripping his bag. There it was again, a muffled sob echoing from somewhere in the building. Following the sound down the narrow hallway, Sullivan discovered the source. In the corner of the small changing room, hunched against the cold concrete wall, sat 16-year-old Danny Martinez. The white belt around his waist was stained with sweat and dirt from the evening's training session. His shoulders shook with silent tears, and his knuckles were scraped raw from practicing kata against the heavy canvas makiwara boards that Sullivan had built himself. Danny had been coming to the dojo for 3 months now, ever since his family had moved to Springfield from Chicago. His father worked double shifts at the local steel mill, and his mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the north side of town. The $25 per month for karate lessons was a significant expense for the Martinez family, but they had agreed to it after Danny came home with a black eye and torn clothes one too many times. Sullivan had noticed the boy's dedication immediately. While other students his age were more interested in the flashy kicks they saw Chuck Norris perform in tournaments, Danny focused on the basics with an intensity that reminded Sullivan of his own early training. The teenager arrived 30 minutes before each class to practice his stances and stayed after to work on his blocks and punches. He never complained about the repetitive drills or the aching muscles that came with proper conditioning. But tonight was different. Tonight, Danny's usual quiet determination had cracked, revealing the pain he had been carrying beneath the surface. Sullivan approached slowly, his footsteps deliberate on the polished wooden floor. The dojo rules were clear about respect and discipline, but they said nothing about compassion. "Martinez," Sullivan said quietly, using the formal address he maintained with all his students. "What brings you to tears in my dojo?" Danny looked up, his dark eyes wide with embarrassment. He quickly wiped his face with the back of his hand, leaving streaks across his cheek. "Nothing, Sensei. I was just leaving." His voice cracked with the strain of trying to sound normal. Sullivan set down his bag and studied the young man. In the 3 months since Danny had started training, he had never seen him show weakness. Even when the older students had tested his resolve with harder sparring sessions, Danny had endured without complaint. Something significant had happened to break through that carefully constructed wall. "Stand up, Martinez," Sullivan commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had shaped dozens of young men over the years. A karateka does not hide in corners like a wounded animal. Danny struggled to his feet, his legs still trembling from the evening's training. His white GI was wrinkled and damp with perspiration, and his bare feet were positioned in the ready stance that Sullivan had drilled into all his students from their first day. Despite his emotional state, the boy's muscle memory held true to his training. Sullivan circled Danny slowly, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The teenager's hands were positioned correctly, his spine straight despite his obvious distress. Whatever had driven him to tears, it had not shaken his fundamental commitment to the art they were both learning to master. "Tell me what happened," Sullivan said, his voice softer now but still carrying the expectation of honesty that defined their relationship. In his years of teaching, he had learned that the most important lessons often happened outside the formal training sessions, in moments like these, when the protective facades fell away. Danny's lower lip trembled as he struggled to find the words. The fluorescent light in the hallway cast harsh shadows across his young face, making him look even more vulnerable than his 16 years suggested. Whatever he was about to reveal would change both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Danny's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he struggled to form the words that had been trapped inside him for weeks. The autumn chill from the community center's poor heating mixed with the cold sweat on his skin, creating an uncomfortable dampness that clung to his white GI. Master Sullivan waited patiently, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture that had become second nature after years of traditional training. "It's my father, Sensei," Danny finally whispered, his voice barely audible in the empty hallway. "He says karate is making me weak, that real men don't need to learn how to fight from some old Oriental guy." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would lessen their sting. Sullivan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had heard similar comments before, especially from working-class families who viewed martial arts with suspicion and misunderstanding. In 1968, karate was still largely foreign to most Americans, associated more with exotic demonstrations and Hollywood stereotypes than with the disciplined training methods that Sullivan had learned during his military service in Okinawa. The master circled around Danny slowly, studying the young man's posture and demeanor. Despite his emotional distress, the teenager maintained his ready stance, his feet positioned correctly and his spine straight. The fundamentals were becoming ingrained, even under pressure. This was exactly what Sullivan had hoped to see after 3 months of rigorous training. "What else did your father say?" Sullivan asked, his voice maintaining the calm authority that had guided countless students through similar moments of crisis. He had learned long ago that the most important battles his students faced were not in the dojo, but in their daily lives, where the principles of karate were truly tested. Danny's hands trembled slightly as he recounted the confrontation that had occurred earlier that evening. His father, Manuel Martinez, had been drinking after another grueling 12-hour shift at the steel mill. When Danny had returned home with his GI bag, still energized from the evening's training session, his father had exploded with frustration and anger. "He said I'm wasting money we don't have on some Japanese nonsense," Danny continued, his voice growing stronger as he found the courage to speak his truth. "He said if I really want to learn how to fight, I should just hit back when the kids at school pick on me. That running away to some karate school makes me look like a coward to the whole neighborhood." Sullivan nodded slowly, recognizing the familiar pattern of fear and misunderstanding that often surrounded his art. In the steel mill communities of the Midwest, physical toughness was measured by a man's willingness to settle disputes with his fists, not by his ability to control his emotions and redirect conflict through disciplined technique. The master had seen this dynamic play out dozens of times over the years. Fathers who worked dangerous, physical jobs often viewed martial arts training as somehow feminine or weak, not understanding that true karate required more mental and physical toughness than most traditional American sports. The meditation, the repetitive drills, the emphasis on respect and self-control, these concepts seemed foreign and suspicious to men who had been taught to solve problems through direct confrontation. "Tell me about the training tonight, Martinez," Sullivan said, changing the subject with deliberate purpose. "What did you practice? What did you learn?" Danny straightened slightly, his natural pride in his progress beginning to overcome his emotional distress. "We worked on the first 3 kata, sensei: Heian Shodan, Nidan, and Sandan. You corrected my hand position in the opening sequence of Shodan and made me repeat the crossing block in Nidan until I got the timing right with my breathing." The teenager's voice grew more confident as he recounted the technical details of his training. Sullivan had introduced kata gradually, emphasizing the importance of understanding each movement's application rather than simply memorizing the sequences. This approach was consistent with the traditional JKA methods that Sullivan had learned, where forms were taught as fighting techniques rather than mere physical exercises. "And what about your conditioning work?" Sullivan pressed, knowing that the Makiwara training was particularly challenging for new students. The canvas-wrapped striking post that he had constructed behind the dojo required months of gradual conditioning to develop the proper calluses and striking technique. Danny held up his scraped knuckles, displaying them with a mixture of pride and pain. 200 punches with each hand, sensei. My knuckles are getting tougher, but they still bleed sometimes. I've been soaking them in salt water like you taught us, and the skin is starting to thicken up." Sullivan examined the young man's hands with the practiced eye of someone who had guided hundreds of students through the same conditioning process. The knuckles showed the characteristic abrasions and callus formation that indicated proper training methods. More importantly, Danny had not been complaining about the pain or asking to skip the conditioning work that many students found too difficult. "Your father believes that karate makes you weak," Sullivan said quietly, his words carrying the weight of challenge. "What do you believe, Martinez?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding an honest answer that would require Danny to confront not only his father's criticism, but also his own doubts about the path he had chosen. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the moment. Danny stared at the floor for a long moment, his breathing slowly returning to normal as he considered Master Sullivan's question. The fluorescent light above them continued its steady hum, and somewhere in the distance, the sounds of the evening traffic on Springfield's main street filtered through the community center's thin walls. The autumn of 1968 felt heavy with change, and Danny sensed that his answer would determine more than just his relationship with karate. "I don't know if I'm getting stronger, Sensei," Danny finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I'm different than I was 3 months ago. When those kids at school push me around now, I don't just get angry anymore. I think about what you taught us about distance and timing. I think about breathing and staying calm." Sullivan nodded slowly, recognizing the subtle but significant shift in the young man's perspective. This was exactly the kind of internal development that traditional karate training was designed to foster. The JKA methods he had learned emphasized that physical technique was inseparable from mental discipline, and that true strength came from the ability to remain composed under pressure. "Tell me more about these incidents at school," Sullivan said, moving to lean against the wall where several photographs of Okinawan masters hung in simple black frames. The images showed serious-faced men in white gi, their expressions reflecting the gravity and dignity that Sullivan tried to instill in all his students. Danny's posture straightened as he found the courage to share experiences he had never spoken about before. "There's this group of seniors who like to pick on the Mexican kids. They call us names, push us around in the hallways, steal our lunch money. Before I started training here, I would either fight back and get suspended, or I would run away and feel ashamed." The teenager paused, gathering his thoughts as he had been taught to do during meditation practice. Sullivan had introduced basic breathing exercises to all his students, explaining that mental clarity was as important as physical conditioning in true karate training. "But last week, when they cornered me after school, something was different," Danny continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Instead of panicking or getting angry, I just watched them. I could see their balance, their distance, where they were vulnerable. I didn't fight them, but I wasn't afraid either. They seemed to sense the change in me, and they backed off." Sullivan smiled slightly, the first time his stern expression had softened since finding Danny in tears. This was precisely the kind of practical application of karate principles that he hoped to see in his students. The awareness, the calmness under pressure, the ability to project confidence without aggression. These were the true markers of martial arts development. "Your father sees only the physical aspects of fighting," Sullivan explained, his voice taking on the instructional tone that Danny had come to associate with the most important lessons. "He understands confrontation and force, but he does not understand strategy and control. What you experienced with those bullies was the beginning of real martial arts mastery." The master moved away from the wall and began to demonstrate one of the basic stances that formed the foundation of their training. His feet positioned in the Zenkutsu Dachi that all beginning students learned, his hands moving through the chamber and punch sequence with the fluid precision that came from decades of practice. "In Okinawa, where karate was born, the old masters had a saying," Sullivan continued as he moved through the familiar motions. "The ultimate aim of karate lies not in victory or defeat, but in the perfection of character. Your father measures strength by how hard you can hit someone. We measure it by whether you need to hit them at all." Danny watched intently as his teacher demonstrated the techniques they had practiced hundreds of times in class. But tonight, in the empty dojo with only the overhead light and the distant sounds of the city, the movements seemed to carry a deeper meaning. Each block and strike represented not just physical technique, but a philosophy of controlled power that contrasted sharply with the crude aggression that his father valued. "The conditioning work we do, the makiwara training, the repetitive drills, these are not just making your body stronger," Sullivan continued, his hands now moving through the opening sequence of the Heian Shodan kata that Danny had practiced earlier that evening. "They are teaching your mind to remain calm when others lose control. They are giving you the confidence to walk away from fights because you no longer need to prove anything to anyone." The lesson was beginning to penetrate Danny's understanding in a way that purely physical instruction never could. He had been measuring his progress by external standards, his father's approval, his ability to fight back against bullies, his standing among his peers. But Sullivan was showing him that real martial arts development was internal, measured by qualities that might never be visible to others. "Sensei," Danny said hesitantly, "what should I tell my father? He says if I keep coming here, he's going to make me quit and get a job after school instead. We need the money and he thinks this is just a waste of time and money we can't afford." Sullivan stopped his kata demonstration and fixed Danny with the penetrating stare that he used during the most serious moments of instruction. The question touched on one of the most difficult challenges he faced as a teacher, helping young students navigate the conflict between their martial arts, training and family expectations that often did not understand or value what they were learning. "Tomorrow evening after our regular class, I want you to ask your father to come here," Sullivan said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him the respect of students and parents throughout Springfield. "Tell him that I would like to speak with him about your training. Tell him that I understand his concerns and that I believe we can find a solution that honors both his expectations and your dedication to karate." The proposal seemed to surprise Danny, who had expected advice about standing up to his father, or perhaps finding ways to continue training in secret. The idea of bringing his father directly into the dojo, into the world that had become his refuge from the challenges of home and school, felt both terrifying and hopeful. The following evening arrived with the crisp bite of October air, and Danny's nervousness was evident as he paced around the community center's parking lot. At 6:30 sharp, a battered pickup truck pulled into the lot, its engine coughing and backfiring before falling silent. Manuel Martinez emerged, his massive frame still showing the effects of another grueling day at the steel mill. His work clothes were stained with grease and metal dust, and his weathered hands bore the scars of 20 years working with heavy machinery. Danny watched from the dojo entrance as his father approached, noting the suspicious glance that Manuel cast toward the simple building that housed Master Sullivan's school. The community center was far from impressive. Just a converted recreation room with hardwood floors, a few mirrors, and the basic equipment that Sullivan had accumulated over the years. To someone expecting a fancy martial arts studio, it might seem disappointingly ordinary. Danny approached with the formal posture that had become second nature, waiting for permission to speak. Sullivan gestured for him to sit in one of the folding chairs that served as the dojo's modest furniture, and the teenager noticed that his instructor's expression held a particular seriousness. "Your testing date for Yellow Belt has been scheduled for December 15th, Sullivan announced, his words carrying the weight of significance that accompanied all belt promotions in traditional karate. 6 months of training, consistent attendance, and demonstrated improvement in technique and character. You have earned this opportunity." The news filled Danny with a mixture of pride and nervousness. He had been working toward this moment since his first day in the dojo, practicing the required kata and techniques until they had become part of his muscle memory. But a belt test represented more than just physical skill. It was a formal recognition of the personal growth that Sullivan demanded from all his students. "Sensei," Danny said carefully, using the respectful tone that marked all interactions between student and teacher. "My father wants to attend the test. He asked me to find out if family members are allowed to observe." Sullivan smiled slightly, recognizing the significance of Manuel's request. In the months since their first meeting, Danny's father had gradually moved from skepticism to cautious support, and finally to genuine appreciation for what his son was learning. The practical benefits had become obvious. Danny's grades had improved, his confidence had grown, and his ability to handle conflict without violence had impressed even Manuel's co-workers at the steel mill. "Family members are always welcome at belt examinations," Sullivan replied. "In fact, I encourage it. The discipline and techniques we practice in the dojo should be witnessed and understood by the people who matter most in our students' lives." As they talked, the sounds of the evening cleanup continued around them. Other students finished their own responsibilities and headed home to homework and family dinners. But Danny had learned to value these quiet moments when Sullivan shared insights that went beyond formal instruction. "Tell me what you have learned during these 6 months, Sullivan said, settling back in his chair with the patience of a teacher who understood that the most important lessons often came through reflection rather than action. Danny considered the question carefully, sorting through memories of training sessions, moments of frustration, breakthrough achievements, and gradual understanding. The physical techniques were obvious. He could now perform the basic kata with competence. His stances had developed strength and stability, and his conditioning work had progressed to the point where Makiwara training no longer left his knuckles bleeding. I learned that real strength comes from controlling yourself, not from hurting other people, Danny said slowly, his words reflecting months of gradual understanding. When those guys at school used to pick on me, I thought I had to prove something by fighting back or running away. Now I know that the strongest thing I can do is stay calm and make smart choices. Sullivan nodded approvingly, recognizing the mature perspective that distinguished serious martial arts students from those who viewed training as merely physical exercise. This understanding of karate as a method of character development rather than just fighting technique was what separated traditional training from the more commercialized martial arts, schools that were beginning to appear across America. "And what about your relationship with your father?" Sullivan asked, knowing that family dynamics often provided the most challenging test of the principles students learned in the dojo. "He respects what I'm doing now," Danny replied, his voice carrying a note of pride and relief. "He says I handle problems like a man instead of like a kid. Last week, when there was trouble with some guys from another neighborhood, he asked me what I thought we should do instead of just telling me to stay out of it." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and both instructor and student looked up to see Manuel Martinez entering the dojo. Danny's father had obviously come straight from work, his clothes still bearing the dust and grime of the steel mill, but his posture showed the respectful bearing that he had adopted during his visits to the dojo. "Good evening, Sensei," Manuel said, bowing slightly in the manner that Sullivan had taught him during their early conversations. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, Mr. Martinez," Sullivan replied, rising to greet his visitor with the courtesy that marked all interactions in his dojo. "Danny and I were just discussing his upcoming belt examination. I was telling him that family members are welcome to observe the testing process." Manuel's weathered face showed the quiet pride that he had learned to express since discovering what his son was truly learning in this place. The months of observation and conversation had convinced him that karate training was providing Danny with tools that would serve him well throughout his life. Discipline, confidence, respect for others, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. "I would be honored to attend," Manuel said formally, his words carrying the sincere respect that had replaced his initial suspicion. "This place has been good for my son. It has been good for our whole family." As the three of them stood together in the quiet dojo, surrounded by the simple equipment and traditional photographs that defined Sullivan's vision of martial arts education, they represented something larger than just teacher, student, and parent. They embodied the timeless principle that true strength comes not from the ability to defeat others, but from the discipline to master oneself. The black belt had indeed found a white belt crying in silence, and his next move had changed everything, not through dramatic gesture or overwhelming force, but through the patient application of traditional principles that transformed fear into confidence, anger into discipline, and conflict into understanding. The story of Danny Martinez and Master Sullivan would continue far beyond that November evening in 1968, but the foundation had been established. In a small community-centered dojo in Springfield, 3 lives had been touched by the ancient wisdom that teaches us that the greatest victories are won not against external opponents, but against the limitations we place upon ourselves.